Good afternoon to all. First of all, I would like to thank this forum for its invitation. Today is a special day. 2 exact years of that ballotage take place in which the Argentines elected the first libertarian liberal president in history, not only local but from the world, so something quite strange. As I have always said, something like this does not happen in normal conditions of pressure and temperature. It turns out that the situation the politicians were leaving was disastrous. Argentina was on the brink of a precipice and claimed a drastic and profound change, and that is why we were elected. With that mandate, we dedicated the first 2 years of our administration to solve macro problems and remove the chronic patient, which was the national economy, from intensive care. Today, 2 years later, we begin a second mandate that we will dedicate to generating the conditions to grow as quickly as possible. That is why, more than ever, we need the active participation of businessmen and large exponents of the private sector to get the country ahead. As I always say, there is nothing better for a worker than a businessman, and nothing better for a businessman than a worker. That is why spaces like this are crucial to build Argentina in the morning. And this is so because today we are on the threshold of a giant change in our country. We have just gone through some very complex elections that were a test of fire for our economic program, the most reformist program in history, to have an order of magnitude. The government of Milei, which was the one that had done the most reforms, had made 100 structural reforms. In 20 months, we made 10,000 structural reforms, so it seems that we have a reformist vocation that is a little more intense. There is still a lot left to do, which is to become. To give you an idea, there are still about 600,000 decrees left. The problem is that only 70,000 are digitized, but the good thing is that I can eliminate the decrees. So imagine all that I still have to do in terms of reform. Because although in the economic plan we managed to avoid the catastrophe that the previous administration left planted, it would have been in vain if we had not been able to generate political consensus on it. And therefore, the political attacks of this year put in doubt the arduous economic stabilization that our administration undertook. Throughout the year, they sought to attack the cornerstone of this management, which is the fiscal surplus. In fact, the sabotage of the program began back in March of this year. From that moment, we had to endure more than 14 laws that tried to sabotage the economic program directly. And the economic program is good because we cut government. So now is the time to grow. But all this remained in the past. With the election on October 26, we obtained an unquestionable mandate from the Argentine people to deepen the direction of change. Today, for the first time in decades, we have the people committed to fixing the disasters that 100 years of populism generated in our country, and a government willing to do everything to bring that will and make it a reality. There is a topic that is no less important, which I pointed out at the end of last year, when in the midst of the turbulence that the world was pitting, I had committed to entering an electoral year by tightening the fiscal policy and tightening the monetary policy. And that not only had never happened in Argentina and never happened in the world that in an electoral year, the economic policy was contractive. Well, we did it. And it seems to me that the relevant thing about this is that for the first time also the Argentine people decided to accompany the discipline. That is, they did not fall before the bribe of politics to receive something during the electoral year and then have to pay high costs. So that also seems to me to be a very important signal from the point of view of the Argentines, are having decided to choose to do things right and not fall into the populist trap. And we are going to make all these proposals in reality because basically it is going to happen because today the economic program has 5 anchors. As the economist Federico Domings, 3 anchors that everyone already knows, which are the exchange rate, the monetary and the tax, and it is what they assured the economic program until October. Today 2 more anchors added to it, the geopolitical anchor and the political anchor. The anchor in politics is key. Argentina today has the possibility of being the protagonist of a radical change in global game rules. The United States needs a firm ally in Latin America to help it order a continent that has been decimated for decades by socialism in the 21st century. Sorry, but the actual is small and the papers come together. And on the other hand, the political anchor is neither more nor less than the will of the people who said no to the past. It is our popular mandate, and it is the most sacred anchor of all because it provides a foundation for all the others. Without the support of the people, any action of the state is empty, and that is why it should never be taken for granted. One of the things I was saying throughout the different speeches during this year was that there was something very interesting. In this year, which was the possibility that the Argentines decided to follow the path and that city of freedom or go back, and that although that in the middle generated turbulence and generated complicated situations, because as in chess the blacks also play, it was important to test the will of change that the Argentines had, and this is interesting because 2/3 of the Argentines decided to embrace the path to the city of freedom and decided not to go back to the past, and that seems to me a very important note. I say apart from that, if one looks at the elections in terms of the different forces and not adjusting and mixing things that do not mix, and then later the facts shoot that they did not come together and did not add up, but it was only a strategy to make up what was going to be a furious defeat. Is interesting because the result was 41-24, and 41-24 is called the first grand, and that opens up prospects for not only for us to become up, but to be able to move forward with much more strength, because we are not going to come down our reformist agenda and the support that we have had. What it will do is that we will speed up even more. So buckle up, because there are going to be many more reforms. We also have to understand that this never happened before in our history. No Argentine government experienced anything similar to what we are going to live through in the coming years, not only from the economic point of view, given that more than 120 years ago Argentina was not in super habit without default, but from a political point of view, so that you have an idea. Today we have the same level of popularity that when the government started, but with a triple legislative power, and this after having done all the dirty work of arranging public accounts in these 2 years. If in December 2023 we told you that we were going to be like this today, I think none of you would have imagined it. That is the reality, and that is why today we have the possibility of walking away from 100 years of economic errors, 100 years that saw the fall of our country in the middle of the table and the concert of the nations and our people in poverty. And they said, by the way, if the crisis had exploded together with hyperinflation, we would have seen levels of poverty above 90%. And today we would be living a reality like that of Venezuela. Sometimes it is very difficult to internalize the counterfact, and sometimes when one describes it, it also seems like exaggerated, but those of us who were sitting in the electric chair, we are going to tell you one day what it is due. Life, a season, and hell. But this fall is today an opportunity because Argentina, where everything and only doing things well has the possibility of making a catch-up on its economic growth, because as Juan Pablo Nicolini calculated, with just getting the fiscal balance, Argentina could grow in terms of per capita 4% for 35 years. This is also interesting because this is the same thing that Nicolini himself points out, that when he did the work with Quidjo that they did for the Federal Reserve of Minneapolis, they did not discriminate in the type of adjustment. That is, it was only focused on the fiscal balance, and that with only ensuring the fiscal balance, it generated a 4% per capita and allowed us to do the convergence in 35 years. Convergence is to reach in dynamic terms the per capita GDP of the United States, to put it in easier terms. And the interesting thing is that what Juan Pablo himself said was that he did not discriminate that. What between if that was done by increasing taxes or lowering the expense, and we not only lowered the expense to achieve the fiscal balance, but also lowered the expense in strict figure 7.5 points of the GDP, and that allowed us not only to achieve the fiscal balance, but we did something that no government has ever done in Argentine history, and that is to return to the Argentines 2.5 points and low taxes. In fact, the total adjustment ended up being 15 points of the GDP, where 10 of those points were within the balance of the central bank. And that is what allowed there to be a recovery of credit, because those funds that the state was taking, they began to boost the credit. Now then, the adjustment made by lowering the expense by a floor of 4% per capita, and if you add what we are doing in terms of structural reforms from the Ministry of Regulation, what we are doing from human capital, and what we are doing in terms of international insertion, Argentina could start to grow at rates that oscillate between 7 and 10%, just by reviewing the history of the world and seeing how the growth rate and convergence processes have accelerated. I would not be at all disheveled. What happens is that a country that more than 100 years ago, that the only thing it did was lose places, it seems very ambitious, but believe me, we can achieve it. Now we cannot give this growth percent either. It depends on the fact that the government continues to maintain the fiscal and political responsibility that characterizes us, so that people can save and invest without fear. Without fear, this growth will not fail immediately. It will be a gradual improvement in the pocket of people. Will be shown that the Argentines will be a little better every day. The night has already passed in the country. Today the first rays of the morning appear. But change needs time to illuminate our entire sky. To accelerate this process, now we are going to undertake the challenge of approving the 2026 budget and taking out the reforms in labor and security matters, because the country continues to need more freedom and more security to grow. That is, if we do things right, the world could come to talk about increasing Argentine rates in the coming years. This rate of growth, if we achieve all the reforms, would imply doubling the GDP every 7 years, nothing else. This is not a minor issue, because this means that we could accelerate the rate of growth in the first stage, not permanently, but in the first stage of convergence to rates of 10. In fact, that was what China did. And in fact, China managed to do it for 15 years. Therefore, it ended up quadrupling the GDP in 15 years. And that can be done, and what it requires is not to invent anything. You have to do what the textbooks say, and believe me, none of the things there have to be applied. I'm afraid to apply them. Imagine I load the fiscal deficit to 15 points, the GDP, the rest of the things. So we are talking about each young person who enters high school ends up the same in a radically different country. We are talking about people who know that tomorrow it will always be better. We are talking about making Argentina great again. But none of this will happen as part of a work of magic. It requires local and foreign investment to recapitalize a brutally uncapitalized country. For the first time in a long time, there are correct incentives so that the savings of Argentines can become investment to multiply. This will make the GDP and employment grow year by year, and consequently the salary levels, given the greater number of companies having to compete among themselves to attract employees. Because that is the virtue of the growth of the GDP, which is no other than the increase in productivity. We all benefit from a more productive country, and more companies want to participate in the economy of a productive country, pushing even more growth, demanding more labor, reducing unemployment and improving salaries. And this is fundamental for what we call the cultural battle. When the correct ideas are materialized, the defend is multiplied. Because in the end, what kept Argentina locked up for so long was the proliferation of anti-growth ideas. Politics revolved around an economic shamanism whose proposal was to mint money to month over and stop inflation by dancing in the rain. The reality is that we have political leaders who celebrated the opening of the sovereign debt as if it had no consequences for citizens, and they show people the false belief that he can spend more than he has. The cultural battle is not a minor issue. It is much more important than it seems, because
el tema de la batalla cultural no es un tema menor, o sea, es un tema mucho más importante de lo que parece, porque
we generally have three lines of action. We have the management line, which is quite
tenemos tres líneas de acción. Tenemos la de la gestión, digamos, la cual es bastante
tangible. It is seen with regularity. We have a part that is the work in the political arena.
Una parte que es el trabajo en la arena política.
In fact, my sister created the party, and in only 6 months she managed to
Creó el partido y en solo 6 meses logró
put it in the 24 districts, and not only that, but also despite the most brutal campaign
24 distritos, y no solo eso, sino que además, a pesar de la campaña más brutal
that took place in history, because they beat the one in 23, despite that we got 41%
sacamos el 41%
other votes, and 2/3 of Argentina was painted purple, when everyone, 15 days
cuando todos 15 días
before or a month before, thought that the government was falling. And not only that,
creían que el gobierno se caía. Y no solo eso, sino
but also another very important issue for us, and that we believe that what gives sustainability
para nosotros y que creemos que es lo que le da sustentabilidad
is the cultural battle. That is, if people are not
cultural. Es decir, si las personas no están
committed to ideas, one can be a good government, 2 good governments, 3, but sooner or later, the germ of socialism is always there. Look, I remember, to understand how this works.
Miren, yo me acuerdo para entender cómo funciona esto.
I remember that once a friend of mine had gone on vacation to Cuba, and then there was a boy who was all day asking for money. And of course, obviously, when the moment came, he got tired and gave him $1, and another later he gave him another $1. Of course, what one did not realize is that that was more than what he earned being within the communist system. So, in socialism, who are the our sides? In reality, the incentive is all the time to try to steal from the productive, and everything is a great construction and a great story to steal from the productive sector, and they are always going to be the harbinger. And the stronger the growth process is and the more prosperity there is, the more they are parasites, the more they are going to twist the bit. That is why the cultural battle is so important, and that is why one has to work hard in transmitting the values to people and stop manifesting the only thing that brings those ideas is not only that they bring delay for everything that implies in terms of values. In fact, societies that are more socialist are less happy because they basically embrace the idea of envy, hatred, resentment, theft. The treatment is the same against the law. Nothing good from that can come out. In fact, that was Sodom, and Sodom ended up getting destroyed. So precisely, this is what we are fighting. Day by day, in every step we take. That is why the constant defense of the ideas of freedom is so important to strengthen this process, because credibility and the future of Argentina depend on the fact that these ideas do not again conquer the popular ideal. We must not allow socialism to dry out the process of accumulation of Argentine capital, because that is the only thing that makes nations powerful through an increase in productivity and quality of life. For this reason, we are now entering a virtuous circle where economic growth and cultural advantage are rejuvenated. The improvement in quality of life strengthens more and more voters, and this deepened economic growth even more. In October, we caused the rebirth of this process, and there is no turning back. Today is the time for Argentina to grow, but we can't give this for nothing. It still depends on us not to neglect or loathe God. We know what is at stake, and we know that the adversaries are looking for every possible opportunity to put their teeth back in a public era. They are going to be aware of any error on our part, and we cannot give them the pleasure. We cannot, or we are not going to relax. We are not going to lower our defenses. We are going to fight every battle as if it were the last. I say what I see, that every battle I take it as if it were the last. We already saw a few weeks ago what happens when we reestablish and they regret dreaming of returning. That is why we have to redouble our effort. Today the incentives are water for the first time in decades, and Argentina presents a unique investment opportunity in a country that is on its way to become the freest country in the world and become a global lighthouse. Of all these disenchantments, we finally learned what to do and how to do it. Making Argentina great again is not an empty promise. It is a commitment engraved in stone that will be materialized day by day in reality, because we have a huge amount of potential opportunities that deserve to be taken advantage of. We have a mountain range rich in minerals that the global economy needs, and that for a long time we have resisted exporting. We have a commonwealth of unique ecosystems that allows us to diversify our economy from agriculture in the Pampean plain to the extraction of oil and gas in the desert, tourism in the lakes, or wine in the mountain. And if that were not enough, we have as a goal to be pioneers in the industry of artificial intelligence and to be referenced again in the nuclear energy industry, given our immense amount of desert land at low temperatures. It is interesting to mention it's about artificial intelligence, because in reality what artificial intelligence allows is to enhance growing performance, and to enhance growing performance is to allow economic growth to be achieved. That is, I usually mention it to artificial intelligence as it would be the idea of the pin factory, but a 21st century model. And this is interesting because the impact it will have on growth rate is enormous, and if we focus on that, it will benefit us greatly to grow much faster and improve the quality of life of all Argentines in a way that is going to be very tangible and very little time, and that is not a minor issue. That is why I always remember when I was studying.
Yo recuerdo cuando estaba estudiando,
When I had to do economic growth in almost all economic growth books.
en casi todos los libros de crecimiento económico,
I did not say all of them because I read many, but I did not read them all.
pero no los leí
So
todos. Entonces,
there's a phrase by Robert Lucas Jr. that says that the consequences of economic growth
las consecuencias del crecimiento económico,
on human well-being are so overwhelming that when one begins to think about this, one cannot
cuando uno empieza a pensar en esto, no puede
think about anything else. The reality is that when I was a young man studying at the university, I said to another professor who believes that his subject is the most important, which after being
pensar. Después de ya siendo un
a bigger man, I realized that it is good that is because that makes one give the subject
la materia
with a lot of passion because he believes that it is the most important thing, which was not wrong.
estaba mal.
But apart from that, afterwards the future of life led me to specialize in economic growth, and
Me llevó a especializarme en crecimiento económico y
the best of all is that I discovered that Lucas was right. That is, when one begins to think
empieza a pensar
about this type of thing, it is so shocking about human well-being that suddenly he cannot
que ciertamente no puede
stop thinking about anything else. It must be because of that I sleep between 4 and 6 hours a day.
o sea,
But hey, the one who likes the peach is the one who farts. So here I am and this.
al que le gusta el durazno que se banque la pelusa. Así que acá estoy. Y esto
Will inevitably generate that throughout the work of the people it is worth more and more.
cada día más.
And this means better wages and a thriving economy that allows Argentines to live
Economía pujante que permita que los argentinos vivan
full lives away from the misery that socialism brought us in the 21st century. To continue
llevando adelante
carrying forward all this, what we did was nothing more and nothing less than
volver a abrazar
embrace the ideas of capitalism again, of free company capitalism, which is no other thing than the moral Jewish-Christian values that made the West great in the first place.
que hicieron grande a Occidente en primer lugar.
This is very interesting when I discussed it with Jesus Welcher de Soto.
Interesante cuando lo condecoré a Jesús Huerta de Soto.
I was very impressed with one of his works called The Theory of Dynamic Efficiency,
Se llama La teoría de la eficiencia dinámica.
which is basically a work that shows how the ideas of freedom lead
Trabajo que muestra cómo las ideas de la libertad conllevan a
to maximum economic growth and beyond.
económico. Y más allá, digamos, de
Other proposals were all the literatures reviewed in terms of welfare analysis.
en términos de análisis de bienestar,
The interesting things when part 4 arrives, which is the final part of the work, it says
que es la parte final del trabajo, dice
that efficiency and justice are two sides of the same coin. I say, I understand that many
son dos caras de la misma moneda. Digo, yo entiendo que a muchos
must find it obvious, but for those of us who are forming an economy, it is a whole
estamos formando una economía, es toda una
thing because basically what it says is that something that is efficient
Lo que dice es que algo que es, digamos, eficiente
cannot be unfair. That is, in the altar of Pareto efficiency, we cannot be
el altar de la eficiencia paretiana no podemos estar
sacrificing justice, and that is what economists do regularly, politicians do it
economistas lo hacen regularmente. La política lo hace
regularly. Politics is not in general guided by utilitarian questions, not by questions of
se guía por cuestiones utilitaristas, no por cuestiones de
values. However, one of the things that we have decided from the first moment
Una de las cosas que nosotros hemos decidido desde el primer momento
that we arrived at the administration was, at least that is my task, to fix the North.
fue, al menos esa es mi tarea, fijar el norte,
To say where we want to go and what instruments are allowed to use and what instruments I will not
instrumentos está permitido usar y qué instrumentos no voy a
tolerate.
tolerar.
Never the utilitarian political calculation will be above the
El político utilitarista va a estar por encima de los
values, and this is very interesting because when you purse it in these times,
interesante Porque cuando ustedes lo plantean en estos términos,
The result that derives from the other is wonderful because then it implies that everything
porque entonces implica que todo lo
that is efficient necessarily has to be fair. That is how efficient it has to be fair.
ser justo, es decir, lo eficiente tiene que ser justo.
That is, you cannot sacrifice anything in terms of justice for supposed
Nada, digamos, en términos de justicia por una supuesta
efficiency, that is to make the account wrong, how to say it in some way. Now the most extreme reflection
La reflexión más extrema
of all this is that if you work in a fair way, and we all know that because it is
justa, y eso lo sabemos todo, porque está
at our base of the Jewish-Christian values, is that doing what is correct, ethically and
haciendo lo que es correcto, ética y
morally correct. They may not know anything about the economy and lead the economy on the maximum
y conducir a la economía en el máximo
path of
sentido
growth, generating well-being for all, and that also anchored on the values
y eso además anclado sobre los valores
generate better societies, not a society of envious and resentful people who are willing to destroy
envidiosos y resentidos que están dispuestos a destruir
everything
todo.
because they do not like the other. Therefore, as I said before, it is not only in
Por lo tanto, como decía antes, no solo
the matter of management, it is not only the political arena, but also the way of
no solo, digamos, es la arena política, sino que también es la vía de la
the cultural battle, because embracing the Jewish-Christian values is what will allow us to
judeo-cristianos, es lo que nos va a permitir
achieve the civilizational achievements and well-being of the West. So I have said this. Thank you very much
que dicho esto, muchas gracias
to all for accompanying me, for listening to me. May God bless them. May the force of the
fuerza del
Sky accompany us, and long live freedom. Damn it.